tonight, we're going to talk about what the first 7 presidents thought about the Constitution and what they believed it was. We're going to particularly zero in on Andrew Jackson, who should be on Mount Rushmore. How do you like that? We've absolutely disgraced what he did. And today he's in oblivion, and all you hear about him is bad things. We're going to talk about Jackson. What a great president he was. Absolutely great, and we'll talk about him. And then we're going to talk about my favorite president, who without him, we don't have the core soul of what we believe in that America is, and that is, it's Thomas Jefferson. And he is in the process of also being destroyed in the year 2015. But we're going to make sure that they don't do that, and we're going to make sure that we tell what the truth of Jefferson is also. Now, I want to start off, let's see, Mary's here. I want to start off with a little blip. I was at the cabinet meetings of George Washington, and I decided to record the meetings.
Thank you.
And at this meeting, now I want to tell you this. This is from the HBO special on John Adams. The crux of America is a conflict between 2 men. One of them is Jefferson, and the other one is who? Not Adams. Is Hamilton. It's Hamilton and Jefferson. And there was a disagreement, big disagreement. Jefferson says in his writings that it was like 2 cocks at fighting each other every time we went to the cabinet meetings. Because one believed the government should go one way and we should build it upon moral principles. The other believed that we should have a bigger centralized government because as he fought the Revolutionary War, he saw that the central government didn't do anything. Hamilton did some very good things. He also did some things that weren't so good. But we're going to see the discussion. I recorded this for you. I've lived a long time now. And so, Mary, would you play this for us? And Stu, maybe you can turn the lights off.
In Philadelphia, much change, Mr. Jefferson.
More change than I could have imagined, Mr. Hamilton. Not the city itself. All cities swallow everything in their weight.
That's no surprise to me. That's why I abhor them. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in a federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
Well, sadly, that is very well said. But there can be no question. Our nation cannot bind together without powerful central government. But we must also accommodate the needs of our constituent states, both North and South. Now, the power of one must check and balance the other. And to that end, we must dedicate all of our energies and our care.
I would like to welcome Mr. Jefferson home. Mr. Secretary of State.
Here. Mr. President, gentlemen.
There are cabinet matters that I would like to discuss. If you would excuse us, Mr. Earl. Please convey my regards to your wife.
Gentlemen.
John?
Mr. President.
Mr. President, and nothing more.
There's the argument. Here it is. Do we have a central government with this kind of power that, let's be fair to Hamilton, he would be appalled at what we've done. I don't think he would be happy with where we are now. But the philosophy came, and in 1936, we had a court case. The United States Supreme Court had a case called Butler versus the United States. It was a 6-3 vote. It was on agricultural subsidies and the AAA in the New Deal. And the court, with Justice Owens as giving the opinion, said that we are now going to not interpret the General Welfare Clause as Jefferson and Madison interpreted it. We're now going to take the interpretation of Hamilton. And they repeated that at the end of the decision to make sure you understood what we're going to do now. Now, what was the federal budget in 1936?
Up at zero, practically.
$6 billion. That's because Calvin Coolidge cut the budget. When he was president, it was $7 billion. So it was $6 billion, and in 2 generations, it was $600 billion. Because we took the General Welfare Clause, and the Supreme Court said the General Welfare Clause means what Hamilton said it meant, which is very different. We had been interpreting the General Welfare Clause up until 1936 the way Jefferson and Madison thought it should be interpreted. Well, the first 7 presidents, except for John Quincy Adams, starting with Jefferson, had a very different idea about the Constitution and about what it meant. What did they think it meant? What was their idea of the Constitution at that time? Now, who were the first 7 presidents? The first president was who? You are so smart. I just think you guys are great. Who's the second president? Adams. And third?
Jefferson.
Fourth? Right? Fifth?
No,
Monroe. Sixth?
John Quincy.
Quincy Adams. And seventh?
Andrew
And Jackson. Okay, so those are the first 7. Okay? And Jackson saved the country. Jackson saved the country. And he's the only president. Let's see. They better not change that $20 bill. I'm going to tell you right now. If they try to mess around with this $20 bill, all the powers of heaven are going to come down and smite whoever changes this $20 bill. Now, let me show you something here. Here's a $20 bill. What's that?
Is that the most amazing thing ever?
Well, I don't want, somebody said they want a woman on the $20 bill, and I said, well, I don't want the $20 bill. Well, you're what am I?
Chauvinist.
A sexist. Yeah, that's it. You're a sexist. I said, forget about that. I don't want Jackson taken off. I don't care about that other stuff. Jackson stays. Now, he's the only president in the history of the United States of America that did what?
Abolished the bank.
He did what?
Got rid of the bank.
He got rid of the bank, but that was good. But there's something else he did.
Shot a guy.
Oh, he shot a few guys.
Killed the Indians.
There was something that he did as far as fiscal responsibility that no other president's done.
He balanced the budget.
Oh, balanced the
He
budget.
got us out of debt. We had a surplus in 1835. $35 million surplus. No national debt. Only president to do that. How did he do it? This is it. We have to go back and see what worked. He sold off public lands. Guess what? That's what we're going to have to do. You're going to go into a crisis period. You're going to go into a crisis. It's going to happen. Just brace yourself for it. It's going to happen. Yeah, we don't want it to happen. I know that. I don't want it to happen. I don't want the book of Revelations to come true. But it's there. But we're going to go into this period, and at some point, somebody's going to have to say, well, we've got this debt, and we're going to have to do something about it. Now, I've talked to some people about this. They said, I don't want the public land sold off. Because I like what Teddy Roosevelt did. He nationalized the parks. He had all these monuments. Boy, I think we've got people from Mars wanting to destroy this history class.
There's an Amber Alert.
You got an Amber Alert?
Yeah, I don't know.
Thanks for coming to class. What's that?
We're over North Bend.
Is that North Bend?
Yeah, it is Amber Alert.
Okay. Anyhow, you're going to have to sell the public lands. That's going to have to be on the table. Now, we've got public lands in... what percentage of Alaska is federally owned?
About 90%.
94%. This is absurd because you're talking about political decisions from Washington, D.C. You want to go to the Prudhoe Bay? You can't do it. There's too many caribou up there, so we can't go in there. But let Alaska make that decision. Maybe they'll sell it off. Maybe we'll pay the national debt down.
Who's gonna watch it frozen?
You're going to have to do things like this. Now, this is what Jackson did. Of course, you had a big country at that time, but he sold off a lot of public lands, and his idea was, it is immoral to allow the next generation to pay off the debt of the previous generation. It's, okay, all right, we got it. Jackson said it was immoral for each generation should pay off their own debts. Otherwise, you're leaving it for the next generation. That's immoral. Now, many of the early founders felt that way. Jefferson was the first president that cut the government. He cut the budget. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. Now, I want to talk about Jackson. And have you read this yet? Or are you still playing around with it?
Oh, yeah.
Have you read it? Have you read anybody read all of it? I think Val has. This is called the Federalist Papers. If you do, you'll probably do more than the Supreme Court has done right now. I would suggest that you read this. What is the Federalist Papers?
It's a sales job for
a
the
news
Constitution.
publicizing some ideas that Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay wrote when they were trying to develop the Constitution.
They were trying to convince people to ratify the Constitution. There were letters. Now, in those days, you could write like a 700-word letter, or even more. Today, if you write a letter to the Mail Tribune, you got 200 words you can use. Unless you write an opinion piece, and then you can have about 700 words. But they were writing a lot of words, and their words were pretty deep. You need to read this.
They had a population that could understand it.
Well, the population understood a lot of what they were doing. You had a pretty educated... Well, listen,
Because they were all.
Madison was 10 years old. He was learning about Plutarch. He wasn't interested in sex education. He was interested in Plutarch, in Cicero, in Blackstone, Polybius, Adam Smith. A young boy went to a country school, a little country school. He learned all this stuff. One of the most brilliant, if not I would say James Madison was the most brilliant theoretician this country's ever had. 5'4", 100 pounds, dripping wet. Nobody weighs 100 pounds here. You're Americans. You go to McDonald's. You don't weigh 100 pounds. He weighed 100 pounds. He was sick a lot of times, sick a lot of his life, but he lived to be 85 years old. How do you like that? Well, he wrote 29 of these. Very convincing. He talked about what a democracy is. He said, we don't want a democracy. It's dangerous. It's dangerous, and until Woodrow Wilson said, we want to keep you safe for democracy, which was wrong. I don't want to be safe for democracy. We're not a democracy. What are we?
Republic.
I pledge allegiance to the flag, to the republic for which it stands. But what kind of republic are we? Or where were we? Ah, you guys are studying. You're listening. Constitutional Democratic Republic, because China's a republic. They're not a constitutional democratic republic. As a matter of fact, they're a communist nation. They call themselves a republic. Well, this is very important to read this. Madison wrote 29 of them, like I said. Hamilton wrote 51 of them. Hamilton, boy, you got him started. He just took off. Wrote 51. And John Jay, who was sick a lot of the time, he wrote 5 of them. There were others that were writing, but it didn't work out for the others. This will give you the meaning and substance of the Constitution. You have to have the Federalist Papers by your side. You know what the Constitution means? People are going, I've been teaching this now, and people are saying, well, look, the General Welfare Clause. Well, yeah, but the General Welfare Clause doesn't mean what you think it means. Well, yes, it does. It means that the congressman or my senator could go back to Washington, D.C., and he just got me an overpass and a sewage plant. Oh, that sewage plant out there, that's great because, we didn't have to pay for it in the state. Well, that's not the General Welfare Clause. Oh, yeah, it's the general welfare of the United States. Well, have you read the Federalist Papers? Well, what's the Federalist Papers? Well, that's where Madison said what the General Welfare Clause meant. They all knew what it meant. It's only what's enumerated for the general welfare. See, the General Welfare Clause, that was taken from the Articles of Confederation. That's a term that was used. Anyway, I would suggest you read this and read it out loud. Very slowly. Read it to your children, because your children are going to have to save the country. They're going to have to save this country. We've put a lot of stress on the next generation, next couple of generations. Because if the country's to be saved, you're going to have to know the history of the country to be able to save it. Otherwise, how are you going to save it? So I would read this to your children and your grandchildren out loud, and I would read Federalist 10, Federalist 51, Federalist 45, and did you do the homework assignment I gave you? What was I gave you Federalist 78. Did you read it? You did read it? How'd you like it? Oh, I know Craig read it. He probably read it 3 times. Read 78, because then you'll know how to attack when you have an opportunity in your life and you don't know what tomorrow brings. You don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. So read Federalist 78, and you'll know the original understanding of the judicial department, the judiciary. And that was Hamilton who wrote 78. Hamilton I don't even like, but 78 is a great piece of literature, and we are way off. Oh, by the way, did you learn in high school that there are 3 co-equal departments of government?
Sure.
Okay, that's a myth. It's not true. Why isn't it true? They're not equal. Why aren't they equal? They're co-equal. That's what we learned. I learned that in school. I'm so glad I didn't listen to my history teacher. Oh, that was a blessing. I was like a blank slate. I didn't even want to. It was boring. I didn't want to listen to him. That's so good because I didn't get indoctrinated with some things that would not be helpful. Why aren't they co-equal?
The courts are not supposed to be, they're the one that is not on an equal par with the executive and the legislative branches. They are only supposed to interpret the decisions that are made.
So they're giving an opinion.
An opinion.
Now, how do they enforce their opinion? You've let them. You've let them enforce it. They don't have any enforcement power. That's the executive. He executes, he or she. We might get a woman president now. Although
Everybody said, oh, no.
it might be. It might be. He or she executes it. So then why is the Supreme Court become the final word now? Why is it? Why do we think that? Well, because something happened in 1883
Taken over.
that was not good. That had to do with a civil rights decision and what the Supreme Court did on an 8-1 vote. And from 1883, do you know who the president was in 1883? Who's the president? No, you're close. He was right after that. Who was the president in 1883? He was actually a good president. He went down, pounded his fist, and said what the Supreme Court has done is going to destroy this country. It's a terrible thing, terrible decision. They overrode the 1875 Civil Rights Act that Ulysses S. Grant signed and gave all the African Americans all the rights that whites have. And guess what? The Supreme Court of the United States of America in 1883 overrode that decision and said it was unconstitutional. And after they did that on an 8-1 vote, Chester A. Arthur went to the well of the Congress and he pounded his fist and he didn't do anything. And he just let it go. He should have pounded his fist and said, we will not execute that because it's unconstitutional. See, the legislature already voted for that. You can't override that. We're not going to let you override that. You gave an opinion. I don't agree with it. I think it's unconstitutional. We're not going to execute the opinion. And then you wouldn't have had all of this furor we had. Then we had 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal. We didn't need that. That was terrible. That was another 8-1 vote. Oh, I want to tell you, we've kind of gone off the beam. And we haven't functioned the way the founders set up a success formula. It's a success formula, not a failure formula. Failure formula is Marx. Carl, not me. No, my name is spelled M-A-R-K-S. M-A-R-X. It's a failure formula. It's failed everywhere it's been tried. And if it gets out of hand, you got Mao Zedong, you got Joseph Stalin, you got Pol Pot. If it gets out of hand, you got people like Hitler. It becomes a terrible, terrible thing. All right, so now, let's talk a little bit more about Andrew Jackson. The only president of the United States that paid off the debt and had a surplus. No one else has done that. And I don't know if anybody else will do it. Because right now, America is $100 to $200 trillion in debt. And we don't see a cessation of that. That's not a Republican or Democrat debt. That's an American debt. And Americans are going to have to sit down and do something about this. We're going to have to get some people to sit down at the table, because this can't continue like this. And I would suggest that you read, and your children and their children's children, all you young people in here, you read Andrew Jackson's veto message. You want to get an Americana lesson? This is the veto message of the bank. This tells what the departments of government are supposed to do. Have you read this? This is better than any Federalist paper. I keep it in my Federalist papers, actually. It is maintained by the advocates of the bank, and this is when he vetoed. The bank was popular. The bank was popular. The Congress voted overwhelmingly for it. A veto-proof vote in the Congress of the United States of America in 1832. The Senate also voted for it, but it wasn't veto-proof. And he vetoed it. He vetoed it because he was concerned for the American people. See, we don't know all the details of everything. And he took a look at the bank and he said 80% of the money in the bank is foreign money and private investors. He says, we can't do this. There's only 20% federal money in there. We can't do this. This is not good for America, not good for the American people. It is maintained by the advocates of the bank that its constitutionality in all its features ought to be considered as settled by precedent. Now listen to this, listen carefully. And by the decision of the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court had a decision in 1819, very important case. It was called what? See, I took 40 years to put all this together for all of you. And you don't even bring me a chocolate chip cookie. Oh, yes, they do. They bring a lot of good stuff. What was the decision in 1819? Well, it was McCulloch versus Maryland that said the constitutionality of these of the bank, it's constitutional. That was John Marshall. Well, now we come to 1832, and Andrew Jackson says it is not constitutional. Can he do that? Well, yeah, but if you read your history books, you're going to see him with a crown on his head, like a king, like a dictator. You need to read these history books that your children are reading, because they're not good to read. They're very difficult to read because they make you mad. That's going to keep. I'm going to read these history books to the day I die because they'll keep me living. My blood boils, and then I don't need to take any medication. The blood just starts to move. And well, Jackson goes on. He says, "To this conclusion, I cannot assent. I can't assent to what the Supreme Court has done." See, we need Andrew Jackson now. And it goes on. Mere precedent is a dangerous source of authority and should not be regarded as deciding questions of constitutional power, except where the acquiescence of the people and the states can be considered as well settled. All right, now listen carefully to how Jackson decided this. So far from this being the case on this subject, an argument against the bank might be based on precedent. One Congress in 1791 decided in favor of the bank. Okay, that was Hamilton set up the bank, 1791. Another in 1811 decided against it. Now the charter was for 20 years. Excuse me. Who was the president in 1811? Madison. Yeah, you read that good book by Lynn Cheney. That's why you know everything about Madison. That's a great book. Madison didn't want the bank in 1811. They didn't recharter the bank. They did in 1816 because they had fought a war with the British, the War of 1812, and we were really in big debt, and Madison, there was a few changes made, and he then consented to it. So in 1811, they decided against it. Then one Congress in 1815 decided against the bank. They decided against it in 1815 again. Another in 1816 decided in its favor. So you got 4 different decisions now. Prior to the present Congress, therefore, the precedents drawn from that source were equal. If we resort to the states, and by the way, the Constitution is a state document. That's the power. That's where the power is, in the states. Do you ever read the second article? Have you read that lately? I read it to one of my classes this morning. We didn't get through it. Yeah, there's nothing in there. What is the second article in the Constitution? That's the executive branch. There's nothing in there. He doesn't have any power. Executive doesn't have any power. He's got a little foreign policy. He executes the laws. We had a 1946, right after the war, Harry Truman was president, and the Congress signed a bill that gave the president the authority over employment. The president has no responsibility for employment. That's not part of his responsibility. Well, all right, so here Jackson goes on. If we resort to the states, the expressions of legislative, judicial, and executive opinions against the bank have been probably to those in its favor as 4-1. There is nothing in precedent, therefore, which, if its authority were admitted, ought to weigh in favor of the act before me. All right, and then he goes on. If the opinion of the Supreme Court covered the whole ground of this act, it ought not to control the coordinate authorities of this government. Supreme Court gives an opinion. You see, the Supreme Court takes an oath of office to do what?
Yeah.
They do what? Yeah, they to protect and defend the Constitution. How about Congress? Same one. How about the executive?
Well, sure.
All right, so they all have to do that, right? They all have to do that in their positions of authority.
Preferably with your fingers not crossed behind your back.
Well, that's what King John did in 1215 with the Magna Carta. He signed it, and he had his fingers crossed. Oh, yeah, and a sword to his throat. Oh, yeah, I'll sign it. And then he went completely against it. Well, the Congress, now this is what Jackson says. The Congress, the executive, and the court must each for itself be guided by its own opinion of the Constitution. This is a great man, I want to tell you. They don't make him like this. This is Old Hickory, 6'1", 145. He was like a splinter. He's like a splinter, yeah. Boy, I want to tell you, he was tough as Hickory. He had bullets in him that lodged in him that didn't kill him, but they were in him till his death. And on his deathbed, Jackson said, I only made 2 mistakes in my life that I have regrets for. And one of them is that my horses never beat Maria, this racehorse. His horses never beat this one racehorse named Maria. He says, I really regret that. And he says, I regret one other thing, that I didn't hang my vice president, John C. Calhoun. He wanted to hang him. And it was pretty close. It was touch and go for the first term. Then he says, each public officer who takes an oath to support the Constitution swears that he will support it as he understands it, and not as it is understood by others. It is as much the duty of the House of Representatives, of the Senate, and of the President to decide upon the constitutionality of any bill or resolution which may be presented to them for passage or approval, as it is of the supreme judges when it may be brought before them for judicial decision. The opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges. And on that point, the president is independent of both. The authority of the Supreme Court must not, therefore, be permitted. Now listen to this. This is America now. This is what America, this is the crux and the soul and the sinew and the force of this country. And Jackson was the voice of it. He said, the authority of the Supreme Court must not, therefore, be permitted to control the Congress or the executive when acting in their legislative capacities, but to have only such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve. That's what Hamilton said in 78, which you haven't read. But you're going to read it tonight, aren't you? You're going to stay up late. And you're going to do your homework, aren't you? Okay, well, I want to read you one other thing from the Wall Street Journal. Peter Berkowitz, Why Colleges Don't Teach the Federalist Papers. Okay? Now, what Jackson did on his veto message is he wrote something that's greater than any of the Federalist Papers, and the Federalist Papers are pretty great. Most astonishing and most revealing is the neglect of the Federalists by graduate schools and law schools. The political science departments at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and Berkeley, which set the tone for higher education throughout the nation and train many of the next generation's professors, do not require candidates for the PhD to study the Federalist. It has to be required. I want it to be a requirement. If I was king for a day, I want every high school student, before they graduate, and we'll talk about this next week a little bit more, before they graduate, every high school student needs to have a proficiency in the Constitution. They need to have read it and passed a test on it, the Declaration of Independence, and certain of the Federalist Papers before they graduate. That's what they need to know. Now, in the colleges here, in these great universities, they're not required in the PhD program. These universities, law schools, Princeton doesn't have a law school, which produce many of the nation's leading members of the bar and bench, do not require their students to read, let alone master the Federalist major ideas and main lines of thought. Well, if that's the case, that's from the Wall Street Journal, May 6, 2012. If that's the case, then we got a problem. How are you going to interpret the Constitution? How are you going to interpret as a judge? What method? You had Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has a really nice personality. Yeah. And she's the best friends of Antonin Scalia. I think they play cards together. Went over to South Africa and one of the South African nations, and they needed a, they wanted to rewrite their constitution. They said, we'd like to follow the American Constitution. She said, well, don't do that. That's outdated now. You need to do something else. This is Supreme Court justice. Now, we need to read the Federalist Papers. And I'm not interested in the jargon of the Supreme Court. I'm interested in the decision-making process and the thinking. And if you go back to the book, The Brethren, by Bob Woodward, I read that kicking and screaming. That is how the Supreme Court of the United States, it was the Burger Court, from 1969 to 1976, made their decisions, and Bob Woodward interviewed 200 people for that book. And we found that when we read the Roe versus Wade case in 1973, I don't care what side of the position you're on there, it is an absolute disgrace the way that case was decided. It is absolutely, and from a legal position, a disgrace. And the clerks commented in that book they couldn't believe what the justices were doing. They were trading votes. on what they were going to say in the and they do that all the time anyway now. But they were trading votes, and finally they got to a 7-2 vote. And we won't go through that whole decision, but I've gone through it, and it is mind-boggling what Justice Blackmun did there. We need to have the justices, when they interpret the Constitution, I want it interpreted as the people who created it meant. Well, Justice Brennan, William Brennan, who was appointed by who? Who appointed Brennan? Who? Not Roosevelt. Not Truman.
I thought it was
It was Eisenhower. 1956. Yeah, that was a surprise, wasn't it? Antonin Scalia said that Justice Brennan is the most influential justice ever on the Supreme Court, in the 20th century, that is. Now, Brennan said it is the utmost hypocrisy to think that we can sit here as Supreme Court justices and decide what the Founding Fathers thought on these issues. I want to tell you, I'm not an attorney. I'm just a citizen of the United States who's done a little bit of homework. And I want to tell you that you can know what the Founding Fathers thought on these. You can find out what the majority thought. And that's what this is a majoritarian country. Majority rules. You can know what the Founding Fathers thought on these issues. But you have to do some studying. You got to read the Federalist Papers, which you're going to do tonight, right? You have to read Madison's notes. You got to look at the ratifying conventions in 1788 and late 1787. You got to see what the first Congress did, and you got to look at the first 7 presidents, the way they looked at the Constitution. Now, let me just tell you that Andrew Jackson was one of the really great presidents. He should be on Mount Rushmore. So should Madison. Neither one of them are on there. We got 4 presidents on there. 3 of them I highly approve. One of them I would like to take a pick and chisel and go with you one night and get him off of there. And then we can put Jackson and Madison on there, because the other one has a big head, and so you get him out of there, and then you can put 2 instead of 1. But I would say that Jackson, in his, he was a common man. He came up from nowhere. He got sliced in the Revolutionary War when he was 13 years old. Tarleton's band of butchers got a hold of him, and they wanted him to scrub their boots. He's 13 years old. He says, "I won't do that." He says, "I won't do anything for you." And they took a sword, and he put his hand up. They sliced his hand, part of his face, had a scar the rest of his life. I'll tell you, this was a great man. He really was. And he became a judge. He was a very tough judge. He became the first congressman from the state of Tennessee. He became a senator. He ran for president in 1824. What happened in that election?
He got railroaded.
He did what?
I say he got railroaded.
He got railroaded. He won the popular vote.
Yep.
And who did he lose to that year? John Quincy Adams, because it was taken into the House of Representatives.
Right.
Right? And there was a deal made. Now you think, look, if you're in politics, sometimes you have to make a deal. But you want to make the deal that benefits the country. I don't mind making a deal, but you're not going to make a deal that doesn't benefit the country. We're making deals right now with Russia. I don't want to make deals that don't benefit the country. We got to make deals that benefit the country. So there was a deal made between John Quincy Adams and who? Now remember, this was thrown into the House. Who was the Speaker of the House that year? Some people don't know who the Speaker of the House is today. Speaker of the House was a, yes.
What year? Speaker of the
This is 1824. That's good. You look it up.
Looking it up.
1824.
Secretary of State, Secretary of War,
Not the Secretary of State. Who's the Speaker of the House?
Speakers of the House, Henry Clay.
That's it. Right there. You got it. You got it. Very good. Very, very good, Phallus. Very, very good. I do not have a Snickers bar. I would throw it to you. Henry Clay, who ran for president. Same year. He was taken off the list. And he went to the House, and he had a lot of power. He was a very powerful man. And he sat down with John Quincy Adams and for a couple hours, and John Quincy Adams didn't write it down in his diary. Didn't write down what they talked about. But guess what happened afterwards? John Quincy Adams became the President of the United States out of the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay became Secretary of State. And in those days, if you were Secretary of State, that was a launching pad to be the president. Now, Hillary Clinton has been Secretary of State,
You gotta do the same thing, huh?
and that's a pretty powerful position today. She has elective experience too. But Secretary of State can be a very powerful position, particularly when you couple it with elective responsibility. Well, John Quincy Adams got in, and he was trying to make all kinds of changes, and he became a little bit like his father. He was a little bit recalcitrant. He was a great man, a great American, but he just didn't have the people loved Andrew Jackson. As a matter of fact,
You have a personality.
he had a great personality, although some people hated him too. But in 1833, the country should have gone to civil war. How do you like that? Jackson saved the country from civil war in 1833 because they were at Fort Sumter. And they almost started the war right there because at that time the doctrine of what was percolating? No, it wasn't the Monroe Doctrine. That actually was written in 1823. But this was a doctrine that was specious. And it was what? Nullification and secession. And this was John C. Calhoun's doing a lot in the South. And they were ready to go to war, and Jackson, it was 1833, January of 1833. And if we would have gone to war then, I think the country would have been gone. I really do. I don't think the country was ready to go to civil war in 1833. And it didn't happen until 1861, and we had somebody who came along who we've never had again. Never had anybody like him again. And he just happened to be on the scene at the time. He was the first Republican president. He wasn't the first Republican that ran, because the first Republican that ran was who? John C. Fremont. Absolutely. John C. Fremont. But Lincoln came along, and I think Europeans called him a guerrilla, everything else. He saved the nation. And now I'm hearing things that, well, he did this wrong, he did that wrong. Shut up. Stop talking like this. What are you doing? You're destroying everything. He saved the nation. What do you want him to do? What have you done? We don't even know who we are half the time. He saved the nation. Oh yeah, that's a great man. Well, 1833, it looked like we were going to go to war. And Andrew Jackson said, we're going to send 10,000 troops down to Fort Sumter. If you make a move, we're going to act. And the South backed off. And he saved the country from war right then and there. And the American people absolutely loved Andrew Jackson. As a matter of fact, in 1861, when the Civil War started, the American people were saying, we want Andrew Jackson back from the dead to lead us. How do you like that? And when did he die? When did Jackson die? Well, he was born in 1867.
17.
Excuse me, 1767. That's only the second mistake I've made in a couple of 1767, let's write it up here. And when did he die? He was 78 years old. You go to the public schools? Add 78 to that. And when you add 78 to that, you get... 45. That's right, 1845. And they were saying in 1861, we want Andrew Jackson back from the dead so he can lead the country out of the Civil War, because they didn't know that Lincoln was going to do what he did. You know, Lincoln was only elected one time to Congress for 2 years, that's it. And then when he ran again, he wasn't elected. You know why? How come Lincoln wasn't reelected? Well, he was unpopular. There was a reason why. He's why? Well, he wasn't assassinated in 1846. Let's see, 1848 it would have been. No, he wasn't assassinated then. Why wasn't Lincoln reelected? He wasn't reelected because he voted against the Mexican-American War, which became a very popular thing. He voted against it. He said, President Polk, I want you to go. Now, Polk was a Democrat. And he said, I want you to come down here to the House and point, I want you to point on this map where the Mexicans have incurred on our boundaries, our borders. Well, only 14 people voted against that war, and the Congress overwhelmingly, American people wanted to have that war. And he wasn't reelected because of that. And he was never elected to anything else. He was in the Illinois legislature for 4 terms, but he was never elected to anything else. He was not elected in 1858. He out debated Douglas when he ran for Senate. How come he wasn't put in the Senate? How come he out debated Douglas? More Republicans were elected.
The Senate appointed.
Their appointment was politics.
They appoint, and that's exact. Craig's right. They appointed Douglas because there were more Democrats in the state legislature, and so Douglas got appointed. We need to repeal the 17th Amendment. It's time. It's time to repeal it.
We have the same problem.
We need to repeal the 16th Amendment too. Well, we'll talk about that next week. I don't want to get into that now. But we need to repeal it. And we need to go back and get the states' rights back. We've severed that. We can't do that. Now we've got a federal government that started out as a limited federal government. Then you had something called gradualism in the late 1800s. Then you had big government. And now we have Frankenstein. We got to go back. We got to look and see what worked. Well, Jackson was a hero of the War of 1812 at the Battle of New Orleans. And guess what? The Treaty of Ghent was already signed before that Battle of New Orleans. And but Jackson, with a bunch of, you had French, you had, what's his name down there, the Frenchman, Lafitte, Jean Lafitte. You had him, you had some Indians down there, you had all these different, and he gathered all these together, and they destroyed the British. It was unbelievable what they did. And Jackson became a tremendous hero in the United States. He became a household word. He was loved by the people when he was first elected to the White House. They stormed the White House. He almost got killed by the rush of the people that came into the White House. And they opened the window and they told everybody that, hey, this is how they saved him. He was almost crushed, because he opened the whole thing up to everybody. They said, boy, this is our president. This is what we want in the president. Somebody who can relate to us. So they opened the window and said, all the liquor is out there. So all the people ran and they jumped out the windows and saved Jackson. Because they went to all the liquor and they got him out of it. Unbelievable. So, and Jackson got in there, and I want to tell you,
But they almost destroyed the White House, though.
Sometimes I think the politicians have already partaken of that. Jackson was truly one of the great presidents we've ever had. The history books don't. What they do now is, and then we've got to get to Jefferson. We must. I'm going to have to stop here with Jackson. But let me just say this: the history books now have said that Jackson is really a bad guy because of what he did with the Indians.
Well, it's true.
Well, no, it's not true. No, it's not. Let me explain what happened there. Yes, it was a terrible moment in our history. But what happened there? Well, the original idea was Jefferson's, and Jefferson said we need to immerse the Americans into our culture. And when you walked into Monticello, Jefferson had, he knew all the Indian languages. He had maps of all the Indians, where they were. He had like 350 maps. You walked into Monticello, it was like a big museum. And he said, we need to work with the Indians and immerse them into our culture. Well, this went on, and one president after another, and they couldn't get that done. It didn't happen that way. Well, by the time Jackson became president, you had a decision in 1832, a Supreme Court decision. Now listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you, because you're going to need to enunciate this when every single person that you come across is going to tell you the other side of the story. In 1832, the same year that the bank was just vetoed and destroyed by Jackson, and the country from 1837 to 1913 didn't have a bank, didn't have a central bank. That period of the 1890s and the early 1900s was unbelievable. We've never seen anything like it in history. As far as economically, we didn't have an income tax. We didn't have a central bank. Yes, there were some adjustments that had to be made, but it was unbelievable. Well, we needed employment from overseas. We were begging other countries to come here. 1905, we were producing half of all the goods of the world. It's unbelievable, with a very small population of the world and landmass. It was beyond belief what was going on. Well, by the time 1832 rolled around, the American people, there was tremendous fighting going on between the Indians and the white man. And there was a decision that came down that was called Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. Now, I want to tell you about this, just for a minute. Worcester versus Georgia was a decision that basically said that can the Indians be a sovereign nation within a sovereign state? The Supreme Court of the United States with John Marshall was still on there, and we're going to talk about Marbury versus Madison next week briefly. That needs to be overturned. We need to completely obliterate Marbury versus Madison. We'll talk about that next week. The Supreme Court with John Marshall said, yes, the Indians can be a sovereign nation within the state of Georgia. Well, what are you going to have? You got a sovereign state, so you're going to have a sovereign state, a sovereign nation within a sovereign state? Jackson said no. He said, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. He couldn't. So that decision went by the wayside. Now the Congress of the United States says we've got to do something. So they raised the Congress voted, and Jackson signed it, to take the Indians and move them at that time to the Oklahoma Territory. They had $5 billion to do it, and they were given certain lands. Now, the idea is, yeah, but Jackson was really bad because we got the Trail of Tears. And de Tocqueville came over here, Alexis de Tocqueville, and in his Democracy in America, he talks about what he saw, how terrible it was. That Trail of Tears was a terrible tragedy, how the Indians were moving across and how they died, and it was just terrible. When was the Trail of Tears? What year? 18 what?
36.
I can't hear.
1836.
No. Anybody know? 1838.
Close enough.
Who's the president? Who's the president in 1838? Martin Van Buren. The Trail of Tears was a terrible moment. It was not conducted properly. It was not led properly. And Jackson, in his retirement, was beside himself because it was handled very poorly. And Winfield Scott, who was a great military figure, was the one leading that, and it was a terrible moment in time. But Jackson wasn't the president. He wasn't leading that Trail of Tears. Yes, they voted for it. But there's two sides of the story. Don't just listen to one side of it. Yes, it was a bad time. But what would you have done? Forget about what they did. How would you have voted? This is a very difficult problem. Because if you're going to say that a sovereign nation can be in a sovereign state, that changes the whole picture. Now you're going to say, yeah, but it was their land. Was it? Where was the legal grant for it? Anyway, Indians killed Indians for the land. French killed English. English killed French. The Spanish came over, killed people. You got to have a legal way of having the land. It's got to be legal. You can't just say because they were here. Well, there's two sides of the story. Don't get sucked into just one side of it. Well, okay. Now, let's see, is MJ here? Mary. Now we're going to go into the greatest governing president that we've ever had. Governing. I didn't say the greatest president. The greatest governing president. And this is Thomas Jefferson. John F. Kennedy had a meeting one time in the early part of his presidency. And he had all these Nobel Peace and Nobel laureates, some of the brilliant scientists in the nation. Kennedy would do that. He would get all the top flight people, and they came in the White House, they had dinner. And he got up to give a toast, and he says, "This is the greatest collection of minds ever assembled in the history of the United States of America, except when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." Here's Thomas Jefferson.
There is a clergyman who stops at Ford's Tavern in Virginia, which is on the road between Monticello and Poplar Forest. And he encounters a man he terms a respectable stranger. And he engages in a conversation at some length with this stranger. First, they talk about mechanical operations, and he's certain that the man is an engineer of some sort. Then they move on to matters of agriculture, and he thinks this is, in his words, a large farmer. Finally, they talk about religion, and he's certain that the man is a clergyman like himself. The hour gets late, and they go to bed, and the next morning he arises and speaks with the innkeeper and asks for the stranger he had seen the night before. And he describes him, and the innkeeper says, "Why, don't you know that was Thomas Jefferson?"
is the greatest enigma among major figures in American history. I think we're attracted to him in part because of his mysterious character. If he were a monument, he would be the Sphinx. If he were a painting, he would be the Mona Lisa. If he were a character in a play, it would be Hamlet.
He was a farmer, a violinist, a writer, a surveyor, a scientist, a lover of fine wines, and a restless architect who could never quite bring himself to finish his own house. He was a reluctant politician with a voice so soft he could barely make himself heard from the podium. But he helped to found America's first political party. He denounced the moral bankruptcy he saw in Europe, but delighted in the gilded salons of Paris. He was a statesman who was twice elected President of the United States, but did not presidency worth listing among the achievements on his gravestone. He was a lifelong champion of small government who took it upon himself to more than double the size of his country. He endured the loss of nearly everything he held dear, but somehow never lost his faith in the future. He distilled a century of Enlightenment thinking into one remarkable sentence, which began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Yet he owned more than 200 human beings and never saw fit to free them. Thomas Jefferson was a shadow man, said John Adams. His character was like the great rivers, whose bottoms we cannot see and make no noise. He remained a puzzle even to those who thought they knew him best, embodied contradictions common to the country, whose independence it fell to him to proclaim, in words whose precise meaning Americans have debated ever since.
He gave us our creed. A lot of nations emerge from the mists of history, and their basic identity is tribal. It's rooted in groups. Ours is rooted in a great assent, an assent to certain propositions. We are, as Lincoln said, Lincoln being the greatest student of Jefferson of them all, we are a nation dedicated to a proposition. Jefferson wrote the proposition.
He is the conceiving spirit of this country. Somehow, at 33 years old, here he was, and he could write the Declaration, and they knew it. They somehow knew that here was a person who couldn't speak very well, but they knew he could write, and they assigned him that task, and he accepted it.
Jefferson is important because he wrote in imperishable language some of the most important truths about culture and about freedom and civilization. The Declaration of Independence has been quoted back at tyrants by every insurgency movement since Thomas Jefferson. So we have to know about Jefferson because he's the man who found the language to express the greatest aspirations that humanity has.
He said the right words at the right time, and they were never forgotten. Jefferson is American scripture. You must have him on your side if you're going to have a government based upon the people.
This is pure greatness. He tried to free the slaves 23 times. This is a good book. You need to read it. It exposes a lot of the myths and a lot of the lies that are told about Jefferson.
What is the name and who wrote it?
This is called The Jefferson Lies by David Barton. Some people don't like Barton's take on history. I happen to like it. This is a very good book.
What's the author's name?
David Barton, B-A-R-T.
Yeah, he's got a website, Wall Builders.
Yes. What was that? I heard somebody in the back. Yes, yes. It's very, very good. Anyhow, and there's other books. You need to become acquainted. This is the best author on Jefferson that I think probably has ever lived. His name's Dumas Malone from the University of Virginia. He wrote 6 volumes on Jefferson. Here's one of them I brought tonight. He wrote other volumes. He talks all about the slavery issue, and he goes through it in detail. There's more to it. It's just like I was telling you about the Native American issue. There's a lot to these issues. They're not soundbite issues. They're issues you need to study for yourself. Hey, I don't want you to believe what I'm telling you. You go out and study it for yourself. The greatest study a person can do is self-study. Study it on your own. Question everything. Be skeptical. Dig deep and find the truth. And that's what Jefferson said. As a matter of fact, when Jefferson went to the Second Continental Congress, he was very quiet. He couldn't, you couldn't hear him. It was almost like a whisper. He didn't like to, he was the one who started the tradition of not giving the State of the Union address in front of anybody. He would write it out. And all the presidents after him did that until, who?
Franklin.
Who? No, not FDR. You don't blame him for that, too. There was a president who said, no, we got to start talking in front of the Congress, and they've never stopped doing that. And who was that president? No, not Reagan. They did it before Reagan. Who was it? W.W.
Woodrow
Wilson, who won as president because the Republican Party was split up. We had a lot of egos going on there. And we split the Republican Party up between who? In 1912. This is the hit. We need to know this history because it's a continuum here. Because now we're going to go save America, right? So if we're going to save it, we got to know what happened and where it went off the rails. You just had a terrible, tragic accident with Amtrak. Went off the rails. A guy was going 106 miles an hour. He should have been going 50. America's going off the rails. You got to go back and see how they went off the rail. So you got to know that in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt ran against his best friend.
Polk. Or not Polk.
William Howard not Polk. He was living in Iowa then.
Yeah.
No, it was Taft. Taft, who's the only president who did 2 great things. What were they? No other president's done these 2 things. What did he do? He's the only president ever, and he's the only president who will do this, ever in the history of the United States, who was president of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. How do you like that? Did both of them. He was appointed by Harding in 1921. He did one other thing. No other president has done, and no other president will do. And what was it? He took a bath, and they couldn't get him out of the bathtub. They had to pull him. He's 300 pounds. And those days, those bathtubs were narrow. You know, he got into the bath, and they couldn't get him out. And they had to get his aides, and they finally pulled him out. No other president has had that problem. Well, he's what? He probably swelled in the tub. So those are the 2 things that he did that no other president will do. All right, now, when Jefferson went to the Second Continental Congress, you had a king in France and England. You had a czarina in St. Petersburg. You had a sultan in Constantinople. You have a duly invested emperor in Peking. And you had a shogun in Japan. But nobody had the government that would finally be formed in America. And Jefferson is responsible for the ideas of that government, which we now have abandoned. We're very smart today. We're so smart, we've abandoned the whole thing. It's a success formula, and we've just kind of thrown it away. We've got to restore it now. This is the generation, and the next generation, and the one after that, because we don't have much time now. We are not following constitutional principles anymore. Matter of fact, the Constitution is hanging on a thread. And we're going to have to restore what we lost. But in order to do that, we have to know what it was. Well, let me tell you about Jefferson, who now has been thrown under the bus. If you throw Jefferson under the bus, you throw America away. You have to have Jefferson, because you have to have the ideas that he promulgated. Jefferson wrote 20,000 letters in his lifetime. You know, he invented that machine. He'd write a letter, and then he had a duplicate over here. He invented that. He believed in free speech, and I believe in it tremendously. Listen, you don't take the money out of politics by restricting speech. That's not the way to do this. Don't have as much speech as you can get. Now, pornography is not speech. That's obscenity. We don't want that. If you go into a crowded theater and you yell fire, you can't do that. See, free speech isn't completely free, but free speech, the founders wanted political free speech to be there. You want to talk against the President of the United States? You don't get thrown in jail. That's what John Adams did with the Alien Sedition Act. You get thrown in jail. Talk against it. Jefferson was almost fainted when that happened. And he was his vice president. How do you like that? We don't have that today because we have party politics more today. Well, he wrote 20,000 letters in his lifetime. He produced 60,000 documents. He corresponded with James Madison for 50 uninterrupted years. I have, let's see, do I have it with me? I had it last week. There's 3 volumes you can get. It's called The Republic of Letters. There's 1,250 letters in there. You want to learn American history? Those letters will give you American. And also the letters that Jefferson and Adams wrote are unbelievable. They bequeathed all of this to us. They put it all in writing so we could have it today. And we're more interested in a big gulp at 7-Eleven. We got to go back and look at this. There's 3 volumes to the Republic of Letters. Jefferson studied and was fluent in 7 languages, including Anglo-Saxon. See, he's the one who discovered what America should be. He went back to the Anglo-Saxons, and he read it in the original. And he studied it. And then he read the first 5 books of he read the Bible, but the first 5 books he said, hey, this is really good stuff in here. This is the Jewish Torah. He said Moses was right. That civil order he set up. We're going to combine the first 5 books of the Old Testament with the Anglo-Saxon law. And that's the society we want. How do you like that? That's Jefferson. He discovered, do you ever hear that in high school? They don't even study Jefferson in high school, except they talk about an affair that he didn't have with Sally Hemings. That's a lie. That never happened. Well, he studied and was fluent in 7 languages. He read the words of Scripture in the original Greek and Latin. They talk about Jefferson not being a very religious man. He was religious. Every night before he went to bed. I have the copy of the Jefferson Bible in my trunk. He read it every night before he went to bed. He thought the words of the Messiah were great words. He was fluent in Anglo-Saxon. I told you that. He was the first founding father to go back to the ancient principles. The ancient principles are what I told you they were. Anglo-Saxon and the first 5 books, the books of Moses, that greatest of Old Testament prophets. He studied not only the Bible, but the Anglo-Saxon writings in their original tongue. He was Justice of the Peace in Albemarle County. He was a member of the House of Burgesses. He wrote the Summary View of the Rights of British America. Ever read that? He wrote that in 70. Boy, that's something. You need to read that. The Summary Rights of British Americans. He wrote that in 1774. Boy, did he lay it on the line to King George. King George read that, and there was a price on Jefferson's head. I tell you, these were great men. When they signed the Declaration of Independence, the 56 signers of it, they signed their death certificate. But it was our birth certificate. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments were instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Nobody had written anything like this. This is new. We can't say there's nothing new anymore. This is new. And he copied and he borrowed from other philosophers, but he's the one who wrote it. He was there. He was 30. He was the apostle of liberty. That's the God I worship, the God of liberty. The God of freedom and liberty. That's who I worship. We've got to be free. We can't have chains and be slaves. And that's where we're going. I tell you, it's not that long. We've got to stand up now for our inalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and property. Because that's why you set up a government. You want to protect your property. That's what you're doing. You got to have private property. Now, Karl Marx said no. Do you have a question?
I just had a question. Jefferson lived in Europe during what time frame?
He was a minister of Europe during the Constitutional Convention, but he was over there in 1784 to 1789. He was a minister in France. So he wasn't here for the Constitutional Convention, but he sent 200 books back to Madison. Madison read every single one of them.
I understand that.
How do you like that? He read every single book. And then he was prepared. He read it from 1784 to 1786. Madison read all these books. And he was prepared, the most prepared person at the Constitutional Convention. Well, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. It took him 17 days. And the first day, he had most of it written. He wrote it in 2nd Market Street, a brick building there in Philadelphia. And he had his violin with him. And he'd take his violin, and he'd have this little chair that he'd sit in. He'd take a sip of tea, and he'd write some thoughts. That isn't good. And he wadded up the paper and threw it on the ground. And he got up and he took his violin out and he started to play the violin. He wanted to think about what he was going to write. And he sat back down. He brought his swivel table that he invented so that he could write on. And for 16 days, he wanted to get that first part of the Declaration right. And he was thinking, what are they saying in the coffee shops in Europe? What did John Locke say that man should be. What are the rights of man? What are the rights of man? And Jefferson was thinking these thoughts, these great thoughts about America, how to put this society together. And it took him 16 more days to do that. Well, he was a member of the Virginia legislature. He was the second governor of Virginia after Patrick Henry. He was an elected member of Congress. He was a trade minister to France, which I explained to you. He was the foreign minister to France. First Secretary of State. Let me tell you a scene on that. You may not have heard this. You heard that Jefferson had slaves, but you didn't know he tried to get rid of them. He tried to end slavery in America. 23 times he couldn't do it. What are you going to do? You're going to keep over and over again? He tried. Well, he came back from France in 1789, and a letter was delivered to him. He was at a horse and carriage that he was taking up, ascending Monticello. And General Washington was the President of the United States, sent a letter that they wanted Jefferson to be the first Secretary of State. So he was ascending in this carriage, horse and carriage, Monticello, and all of a sudden, all of his servants come out and meet him on the bottom of the hill of Monticello. They opened the door and they were in tears. They were kissing his feet, kissing his hands. They just loved Jefferson. And he actually paid them. Did you know that? No, you didn't know that, did you? No, what you know is what you're getting from the history books today. How terrible this is. It's a tragedy. He was the second vice president of the United States. I want to tell you, this is one great man because he went against the president. He was vice president, but he totally disagreed with John Adams. And I want to tell you what real courage is. He disagreed with Washington. That is courage. Washington wasn't a philosopher. He was a great man. He was an indispensable man. He wasn't a philosopher. It was Jefferson. It went to Jefferson to give us the body and soul of what America really stands for. It's not a large central government. He says we're going to bind them down with the chains of, not the Constitution, the chains of the Constitution. Well, why that? Because we know what human nature can do. And you're going to stick to what's written on this paper. And you're not going to go anywhere else with it. You're not going to embellish it. Because once you embellish, you have a whole field of embellishment that you can go to, and you can destroy the very foundation of what your countrymen wrote. So we're going to bind you with the chains of the Constitution. We're going to suppress human nature. He became the third president of the United States of America, and he served 2 terms. At the end of the second term, he got on his horse. He went to Madison's inaugural. Madison was his best lifelong friend. He went to the inaugural, got on his horse, and he rode to Monticello and never came back to Washington, D.C. the rest of his life. 17 years. Pure greatness. Pure greatness. And he used power very efficiently and very modestly. He wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and he created the University of Virginia when he was 82 years old. 81, actually. And James Madison became the rector afterwards, and he promulgated the reputation of Jefferson. And the University of Virginia became the first university not to become a university of a ministerial type university headed by ministers who were the presidents. It It became a university. Jefferson thought you go to the university and learn whatever you want. And I think this is what young people need to do. They need to learn, have a great expanse of knowledge and learn a lot of different things. I don't want them pigeonholed into one area or another. Learn as much as you can. Well, he was the father of American architecture. Listen to this. How many interests do you have? I like to eat pretzels. I'm addicted to pretzels. But how many interests do you have? Well, let me read this off to you. Father of American architecture. He was the architect of Monticello, the U.S. Capitol, other buildings, Virginia State Capitol, Monticello, the University of Virginia, that's Jefferson's architecture. He helped create Washington, D.C. with Pierre L'Enfant. He was the one who helped create the plans for that. Did you know that? Numerous public buildings and Virginia mansions. He had over 9,000 books. 9,000 total books in his library. He sent 200 books to Madison to help with the Constitutional Convention. You see, his library burned a couple times, and the Library of Congress was burned down by who? The British came over here in the War of 1812 and burned it in 1814. On our own soil, they burned it down, and Jefferson sold them about 6,500 of books. That was the Library of Congress, Jefferson's library. How do you like that? Well, he was an educator. He was a nurse to his wife and to others. When his wife was on, when she was on her deathbed, they had 6 children together. And in 1782, he married in 1772. In 1782, she took very ill. And he was by her bed, and they were reading poetry to each other, beautiful poetry. And they were each reading it. And after she died, he had a lock of her hair, and he put it away. He did that with his children, too, that died. But as they were reading poetry, all of a sudden she expired. And Jefferson fainted. And they couldn't get him to recover for about 3 weeks. They carried him out on a wooden plank into his room. They almost lost him. And he rode on his horse with his daughter Patsy, and she records in one of the books I have, The Domestic Life of Thomas Jefferson. There were many a shriek and wail on those long rides. But he recovered. Not only could he play the violin, but he could tie a artery. He was a physician and he was a geographer. 350 maps of the United States and the world. He was a cartographer. He was a historian, both of world and United States history. He was an accountant. He kept very careful notes. Teacher of his children. They loved him. He was a philosopher. President of the American Philosophical Society for 20 years. He was a scientist. Not only botany, zoology, and astronomy. He was the father of paleontology in the United States. What's paleontology? It's what? Bones, yeah, your digs. He was the father of that. Did you know that? Did you learn that in public school? I went to public school too. I'm so glad I didn't listen. He was a musician. He played the violin, the cello, and he sang. He played the violin in front of the governor of Virginia, in front of George Wythe. You spell his name Wythe, but it's Wythe, who taught him law. Jefferson was a lawyer too. And he played for the governor when he was a young man, 20 years old, 21 or 2. He went to William and Mary. He fashioned his own keys, locks, and chains out of brass and iron. He was an ethnologist. What's that? See, you don't even know what an ethnologist is. How do you like that? Well, it's an ethnologist. Study of the Indian language, customs, vocabularies, and origins. That's what an ethnologist is. He established the archaeological principle of deep dig rather than surface dig. That's a principle. He was a horticulturalist, an agriculturalist. He was a businessman. The Louisiana Purchase. We've never had anything like that. At double the size of America. And they fault him today in the history books. They say, well, yeah, but that was unconstitutional. He's a hypocrite. Because he believed in the Constitution, but that's not constitutional. Well, they passed a resolution. He was worried about that because the Constitution's silent. They passed a resolution to Congress. The Congress voted for it. He signed it. What, you didn't want to have the Louisiana Purchase? I had somebody in another class say he stole it. This is insanity. This is irrationality. We've become completely irrational. We're talking silliness. He was a mineralogist, anthropologist. He was a statesman, author, lawyer. He had a case early in his life. He only practiced law for 7 years, and then he said, you know, the country's going to need me. So he's retired after 7 years. And he argued one of the cases. They said, the word went out. This is a great lawyer. He's got great morality because he defended the fact that the African Americans are by nature free. And he defended a case about that. That was very unpopular in those days, particularly from a man from Virginia. He was a mathematician, a linguist. I told you he knew 7 languages. A theologian. He knew the Bible well. When's the last time you read the Bible? Everybody's got a Bible. Nobody reads it. Oh, you did? You
Every day.
You read it every day? Good for you. The whole thing?
I read the whole thing every day.
I read it.
He was a meteorologist. He was very interested in the temperature every day. You know, he went out there and he had a method to see what the temperature was. He measured temperature from 1776 till his death in 1826.
Yeah.
50 years. He was an inventor. He didn't take any money for his inventions. Parliamentarian. The Senate still uses Jefferson's rules for parliamentary procedure. A landowner. He was a farmer. He developed America's decimal money system, the dollar and the coinage in 1784. He revised and rewrote the legal code and system of Virginia. You know how difficult that is to do that? 1785, there was a land ordinance policy of setting aside public lands for schools and universities. He helped to do that. And I told you about the greatest real estate deal. Now let me tell you some of the people that he read. And then I've got to talk about a few more things. We've got to talk about Jefferson's death. He read, oh, by the way, he had Lewis and Clark go out. Meriwether Lewis was his secretary. He talked to Lewis for 6 months and what to look for and how to do it. Lewis said, I'd never have ever had any education like I had with the 6 months with Thomas Jefferson. He was a chemist. He read the works of Newton. He said the 3 greatest men that ever lived were who? They had a cabinet meeting in Monticello, and Hamilton was there. They didn't know each other that well then. And Hamilton said, who are those 3 little statues on your shelf over there. He said, they're the three greatest men that have ever lived. Well, who are they? He said, well, Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Francis Bacon. And Hamilton said, oh, no, they're not the greatest men that ever lived. And Jefferson looked at him and said, well, who's the greatest man that ever lived, in your opinion? Oh, well, that's easy. Julius Caesar. Well, he read the works of Newton, Locke. Beccario was an Italian that was talked about law and order. Plato, who he disdained, he thought Plato was a crackpot. Aristotle, Seneca, Cicero, Adam Smith, Diderot, Turgot, Voltaire, Pufendorf. Who's Pufendorf? He's a Swede. He read the works of Pufendorf. And you look back who Pufendorf is, he said you got to have a limited government. How do you like that, reading Pufendorf? Pufendorf sounds like something you eat for breakfast.
Yeah, no.
Puffed Pufendorf. He read Bacon, Sidney, Algernon Sidney. What a great man he was. Oh, I want to tell you. Founders read him. Cook, who you spell Coke. Cook, Blackstone, Hobbes, Lucretius, Gibbon, Tacitus, Horatius. It goes on. The list goes on. Just beyond belief. We've never had anybody like it. Nobody like this. He read, of course, he had a museum in his house that was unbelievable when you walked in. He read other ethics, people that were involved with ethics and religious theory. He read a lot of those. Well, let me just tell you, there's nobody like Thomas Jefferson. We need to look back and see what he said and why he said it. When Marbury versus Madison was ruled on by 3 justices of the Supreme Court, it was a 3-0 vote. And John Marshall in that case, have you read that case? It's 21 pages. It won't take you long. After you read Federalist 78 tonight, you go read Marbury versus Madison. In there you find that John Marshall said that the Supreme Court has judicial review. There is no such thing. And the Founding Fathers never intended it to be that. And Jefferson got a hold of that. Marshall had a conflict of interest. We'll talk about that next week. A little bit, because we got a lot to talk about next week. Jefferson and Madison said, this is no law at all. We're going to disregard this completely. This is a fantasy. And now, Antonin Scalia said, we know that Marbury versus Madison was made up, but we like what was made up. Now, if I was on the Supreme Court, I would like it too, because it gives the Supreme Court justices the last word, which they do not have. Not in our form of government. If the president does not execute what the Supreme Court has said, which is an opinion, and the president thinks it's unconstitutional, he won't execute it. And we've had 3 presidents do that. Which 3? Jackson. Very good. Very good. I love you.
We knew.
Who else? Who's the other 2? Who? Well, that's an old another lesson. There's 2 other presidents that said, President Obama hasn't said it's unconstitutional. He's just done what is unconstitutional. There's 2 other presidents that said, no, the Supreme Court's wrong, it's unconstitutional. Now you got Jackson, who had guts. That's Old Hickory. Who are the other 2? Lincoln, Dred Scott, 1857. He says that this is wrong. a black or an African American is a person. Justice Taney ruled wrong here. We're not going to honor this. How do you like that? And there was one other president. So that's Lincoln and Jackson. That's two Mount Rushmore. I've got Jackson on Mount Rushmore. I don't care who's on there. There's one other that's on Mount Rushmore that said the Supreme Court's wrong.
Washington.
Out Washington.
And it was Roosevelt.
Wasn't Roosevelt. That's two. Who else is on Mount Rushmore? I already told you Lincoln.
Jefferson.
Jefferson! Jefferson! Yes. You were going to say Jefferson. Oh, thank you very much. 12 years old. How do you like that? She's coming here to learn American history. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That's right. Well, we need to learn our American history so we can figure out the Supreme Court's not the last word. And matter of fact, a lot of the words that they've enunciated are no good at all. We need to go back and turn around some of the decisions. We can't have Engel versus Vitale. We got to overthrow that. Because that took prayer out of the school. I'm going to tell you how we're going to do that next week. That's not a good decision. Roe versus Wade's not a good decision. Marbury versus Madison, that's got to be overthrown. And there's other cases. I've got about 14 of them. Well, Jefferson took ill in 1826. 1826 was the 50th year, and we'll close this off very shortly here. It was the 50th year of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I want to tell you this story now, because every once in a while in American history, something happens that indicates that this is a very special place, that divine providence and the author of our liberties is watching over this country for good or ill. And we know that there was an involvement with the Supreme Creator. And in 1826, Thomas Jefferson took ill. And Mayor Whiteman, the mayor of Charlottesville, asked Thomas Jefferson of course, Jefferson was in Monticello. He never left Monticello after he was president. He asked him to speak at the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and speak in Charlottesville. Jefferson said, "No, I can't, I'm too ill." But he wrote to Mayor Whiteman. He says, "This is what I want to say. May it be to the world what I believe it will be, the signal of arousing men to burst the change under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government." Then he went on. "That form which we have substituted restores the free right, the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are open, or opening, to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds for hope for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them." Well, July 4th, 1826 was upon us. But it was July 3rd, and Thomas Jefferson went into a coma. And he woke up at 11 o'clock at night, and he asked Dr. Duncanson. Dr. Duncanson was there attending to Jefferson, and he said, "Is it the 4th?" "No, Mr. Jefferson, it's not the 4th." He had asked him earlier, about 9 o'clock. He had woken up and said, "Is it the 4th?" One of his servants, "No, Mr. Jefferson, it's not the 4th." The next morning, he woke up at 2 in the morning. And he said, "Is it the 4th?" "Yes, Mr. Jefferson, it's the 4th." And that afternoon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 4th of July, 50 years from the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the man who authored the Declaration of Independence died as the church bells in Charlottesville were ringing down below in celebration of the Declaration of Independence. And up north at Quincy, Massachusetts, another great man who was the voice of freedom in 1776 took ill. He was 91 years old. They took him out into the outer room, the living room. His family was around him. Abigail Adams had died in 1818. But the rest of his family was there. And a thunderstorm approached and shook the house. An unbelievable lightning and thunderstorm, just as John Adams would speak. And John Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." And he had died 3 hours earlier, because John Adams died at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Simultaneous death of the voice and the pen of the Declaration of Independence. And it doesn't stop there, because the courier from Massachusetts rode down to Philadelphia to make the announcement, and the courier from Charlottesville rode up to Philadelphia to make the announcement, and simultaneously they hit Philadelphia in front of the Pennsylvania State House where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and made the simultaneous announcement that John Adams had died July 4th, 1826, and Thomas Jefferson had died. And the President of the United States gave a speech and said, "It is obvious that divine providence has sealed the death of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and again shown on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence that this country was founded with the help of Almighty God." And that president was the son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams. And this country is of divinity. We'll see you next week.